There you go, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you, Lou, for setting up the Zoom participation, signing people in. Thanks, as always, to Scott, to Bill, to Char for the work on this. And most of all, thanks to people that have stuck with us now through 6 weeks. This is the 7th of the sessions that I hope it's been worthwhile. I've enjoyed hearing from the people that I've lined up. That the topic tonight is listed as human rights in a divided and disrupted world. My inference about the choice of topics, I know the compiler, the editor, John Eikenberry, but have not talked with him about it. But I think what he's done is select topics relevant to the U.S. liberal international order, rules-based system that has been greatly disrupted by our current president, and looking at different dimensions of it. The alliance dimension with both Europe and East Asia, Japan, and Korea, the nuclear proliferation dimension of it, the trade dimension. The topic for tonight, which in the description, not the title, is human rights and international law. And I think the question that motivated the choice of the topic and looking for an author was, how do the things that the current U.S. administration has done, is doing, affected the viability of international law? The author who was chosen to do this, Jose Alvarez, is himself a specialist on human rights and human rights law around the world. He approached it as if the motivating question were, how does the retreat of the United States from active efforts to protect, expand human rights around the globe affect prospects for people and human rights, civil society things around the world? Rather than how does it affect the larger issue of international law, compliance with international law? That the way in which the subject gets framed is not unique to the current period that we're in. That since the end of the Cold War, there have been essentially two polar views about the role of the United States in the international system. One is the indispensable nation view. Madeleine Albright used that terminology. The basic intention, without maintenance of U.S. leadership, which in the way that she used it meant U.S. hegemony, U.S. domination, and able to lead from a position of greater strength than anybody else. That without us, gains of the last 80 years would quickly erode. That the system that we built after 1945 was inherently fragile, is unwanted by a number of countries, and it's a constant effort by the United States to sustain, maintain, let alone enhance it. A variant of that was Dick Cheney. When I served in the Bush-Cheney administration, and that is, only the United States can maintain this system. that there is no system that will maintain itself, no other leader, again, leader meaning hegemon, would preserve the world, the global system, in a way that the Americans built and the Americans take advantage of and have benefited. So the assumption behind both of these positions is that we hold up the system. We're absolutely crucial to the functioning of the global order on everything from trade to security, nuclear proliferation, health policy, preventing pandemics, energy security, climate change, that without us, it goes to hell. I think that's an overstatement. And the article, for those who read the one in the workbook, the article also challenges that proposition. And specifically with respect to human rights and international law. That the one view, the Americans are the pillar, the only pillar holding it up. The opposite view is, after 8 decades, this is no longer the sole responsibility or purview of the United States. A lot of other countries have similar values, similar goals, similar stake in the system at making it work. The difference is not simply one of ego related to leaders. It has to do with willingness to step up, to point out deficiencies, flaws, to persuade countries to change behaviors at times, to lead by example. And the lead by example is what I'm going to focus on in most of my remarks tonight. They have to do with what is labeled soft power, what my late friend Joe Nye called soft power. Countries that wanted to do what the United States suggested because of a moral authority, because it was generating benefits inside the United States, that we were a model. Doing things we said were good to do would increase the likelihood of them becoming more prosperous, better integrated societies, and so forth. That I'll come back to all of these points, but I want to frame it by providing some background on international law, of which human rights law is a subset. That the pattern over centuries has been one that moved from conventional norms, practices that seem to work, being codified into recognized utilitarian approach, and in some cases translated into formal law, codified in treaties, signed and ratified by countries, and in some cases subject to adjudication by the International Court of Justice in The Hague or other authoritative judicial bodies. The United States, certainly since World War II, has been and at times the leading champion of regularizing, of codifying, of conforming to, of obeying, of blaming and criticizing countries that don't conform to that behavior. Major champion of an international legal order. But at the same time, Americans, the United States, has a long and strong tradition of thinking we're special, American exceptionalism. Other, more benighted, more authoritarian, less well integrated countries, societies need laws and need somebody to enforce them. We are a machine that regulates itself, that kind of self-image that is linked to very strong, stronger than personally I can understand, opposition to anything that smacks of global governance or global government. And there's the whole series of extremist crazies that want nothing to do with the black helicopters of the United Nations telling America what it can or cannot do inside or outside of the United States. The UN has no helicopters. If they did, they'd all be painted white or blue for what they are. But nobody should tell us what to do. Our behavior is at least as good as what is prescribed. So we don't need to subject ourselves to monitoring and criticism. I'll come back to this point as I go along, with this dual character of who we are and what we expect is very much a part of our history as well as today. Human rights and the U.S. role in the human rights movement does have some pretty specific benchmarks. After the establishment of the United Nations in San Francisco, 1945, the primary crusader for an international convention protecting the human rights of all human beings was Eleanor Roosevelt. That quite apart from her first lady duties, she became not just a very effective champion, she became a very effective political operator, building support for it. And in 1949, the United Nations adopted a convention, International Convention on Human Rights, the Universal Declaration, I get the terminology right. A second kind of benchmark along the way was Jimmy Carter. That Carter gets criticized for a lot of things, generally thought of as a better ex-president than president. Actually, he was a pretty amazing president. And one of the things that he did was to make human rights an integral part of United States diplomacy. Backed away from the Cold War, anybody that is against communism is an appropriate partner, ally, friend of the United States, which gave us a set of allies and security partners that's a real collection of strange bedfellows. The medieval monarchies of the Middle East, military-dominated regimes in South Asia and initially in East Asia that became our security partners because they were anti-Moscow, they were anti-communist. But most of them were gross violators of the human rights of their own citizens. And Carter had a fair degree of success in building it into the considerations for the US diplomats, for support or non-support for American business wanting to do activities in other countries. That an example of the carryover, after the military regimes through most of South America, in the 70s and the 80s, that all of the disappeared people, the people being dropped out of airplanes, never to be heard of again, in training the military to be more attentive to constitutional procedures. South American military we trained a lot of militaries to go after terrorists, drug dealers, drug traffickers, and the like. And their respect for human rights was, say, problematic. That by the early part of this century, the behaviors were so bad that the Carter legacy gets transcended by Senator Leahy, who wrote into legislation a lot of things that precluded training individuals, military units, or countries that had violated human rights. I know about this one because I was a deputy assistant secretary at the time. And we became one of the stuckees to implement this legislation, to vet the thousands of people that came to the United States every year for advanced military training in US government and facilities. I reacted, we reacted. We can't do that. This is an enormous task to do this. And we did a little pilot of it. And the pilot demonstrated to actually implement this law would have required the equivalent of 11 person years of dedicated effort out of a State Department bureau that had 330 people. So what do you want us not to do? That we prevailed upon Senator Leahy to back off on this. But my point here is it wasn't just in the era of Jimmy Carter, and it wasn't just big questions. It translated down to lots and lots of specific matters. Now we come to Donald Trump, who evinces zero interest in human rights, has no faith at all in multilateral institutions like the International Court of Justice, in international law, that he has taken the, again, longstanding American position, and we're special, American exceptionalism. We can choose much of the time to obey the requirements of international law, but we're not subjecting ourselves to criticism or jurisdiction about our performance in this. The analog domestically for the Trump administration is what is referred to as the unitary executive theory of government, which is the president is like a king. Congress and the courts are secondary. And the unitary executive, the executive branch, should trump anything else. America first is international organizations, international law, international human rights conventions. This is all in the optional category, and I'm not interested for our president. The question posed in the article was, what impact will Trump's actions have on the rules-based order and the role of international law in governing interactions among the 193 countries and dozens more international multilateral organizations? A broader question is, what impact will the Trump administration actions have on the rules-based order and on behavior of the United States as a role model? That the rounding up of immigrants, the non-judicial detaining of people, the whole series of things that have gone on here are visible to the whole world. And American influence around the world, the willingness, eagerness at times of others to work with the United States to pursue objectives, values that are important to us, has been anchored in the role model. So what is happening domestically affects what we can do internationally as well. An even broader question that builds on things I said in the first two sessions of this series. How do human rights and how do international law fit into U.S. grand strategy? The objectives that we have, the means we use to pursue them, the efficacy of those methods. What I hope has come through in not just mine, but all of the speakers in the session. All of this stuff is interconnected. A lot of it is interconnected by design. And what isn't by design is by and large interconnected by serendipity or by inevitability. Things just spill over, they interact, and the system hasn't gotten around yet to making formal legal, like linkages. So let me start by talking about sovereignty and its relationship to international law, and return to American exceptionalism. That throughout our history, now 250 years, Americans espouse pretty strong views on sovereignty. It's not just a MAGA thing. That no country has the right to interfere in our internal affairs. In many respects, that's what the American Revolution was about. That the United Kingdom was interfering in the sovereign rights of the colonies in the state. The Constitution refers to rights. And again, I'll pick this up in a minute. But the idea of sovereignty, what sovereignty is, in its simplest statement, it means that the sovereign, a country, and back when the idea was formed, the leader of that country, the king, the emperor, had complete authority within the borders of that territory. Nobody can interfere with what I do, and I can do anything I want. That's the two dimensions of sovereignty. The idea first got codified in 1648. I'm sure everybody remembers this important date. It's the Treaty of Westphalia that ends the 30 Years' War. It also ends the 80 Years' War. So it's ending a religious conflict and ending conflict between rival empires in Europe. And it's set basic criteria for state sovereignty ever since. Power extends up to the border. It doesn't go beyond the border. Nobody, the flip side of nobody can interfere in my internal affairs is I cannot interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. At about the same time, a philosopher, political scientist, if we had that term back then, named Grotius, declared that international law was based on natural law, was based on, critically, the consent of the government and consents of one state to be bound by rules that would be applied to others. It couldn't be imposed. It had to be accepted. That's carried out to today. International agreements usually takes a long time to draft them, a lot of arguing about them. Then they are signed by countries that agree to be bound by them, but they don't take effect until some specified minimum, which varies by the agreement, have formally ratified it. In the United States, that means treaty approved by the Senate of the United States. So we have signed a number of agreements, but not ratified them because of this quirky character. I'll illustrate that in a few minutes. So international law evolved to fill spaces between what countries could do themselves. Educate or not educate their people, spend money on healthcare or not, build infrastructure or not, allow immigration or not, and umpty-ump variants of that. But things like trade don't fall neatly into one country or another. That management of fish stocks on the high seas, that's critical to whoever is fishing there, but who do the fish belong to in there? This idea of part of a universal heritage of mankind, how do you govern that? You govern that with some variant of international law. So we've got one strand that is managing problems that inherently go beyond the jurisdictional and fiscal capabilities of individual, and the idea of inalienable rights that belong to all people, wherever they happen to live. They're two separate concepts, but they're both a part of this assault on sovereignty, trans sovereignty, greater than national sovereignty questions. One of the most striking to me, having been at it for 60 years, was the agreement that's now 30 years old, called Responsibility to Protect, usually referred to R2P. Responsibility to Protect was initiated by the Canadians and a group of Africans, and then really picked up and driven home by Africans. And what it says, the principle that has now been incorporated in international law, that sovereign entities, countries, have a responsibility to protect the people inside their borders. It's not just, I have the authority to do anything I want with these people, discriminate against women, discriminate against minorities, discriminate against religions. You also have a responsibility to protect them, their well-being, their health, to educate them. And if a country is not doing that, the international system has a responsibility to inform them, to monitor them, to shame them into doing the right thing. But there's a third part. If shaming and advising and providing aid as a blandishment doesn't do it, what it says is the international community has the authority to intervene, can intervene in the internal affairs of a country. That's a huge departure from the traditional view of sovereignty. There were a number of countries that choked on this aspect. And a lot of them say, we don't need this because, of course, we take care of our people. One of the ones that did that was China. China was very reluctant initially to sign on to this. But China was looking to become much more engaged with Africa. partly for energy, partly for construction, partly for access to metals, minerals. This was a big deal to the Africans. And the Africans made pretty clear if the Chinese want to play in Africa, they got to sign on to R2P. And there are things that fall from that, like ability to do peacekeeping forces under UN auspices, way in which countries respond to natural disasters. There's a whole series of specific consequences. And one of the things that has happened over time is that China has changed from being a grumpy, reluctant observer or acceptor of R2P into actually one of the champions for making it stronger. So why would it do this? They also think they're exceptional, no right to interfere in China. But as they begin to have tens of billions of dollars of investment in Africa, in South Asia, they could no longer not care about treatment of workers, about poor judicial systems, about informal taxation, about enforcement of informal taxation by beating up the workers that came to their facilities. So there's enlightened self-interest, as there is for all countries on all issues. I'm just using that example. All states seek the protection of international law. Understandable for small and weak states, right? Protect me from the big guys. So laws attempt to deter aggression, invasion, seizure of territory, what the Russians did in Crimea in 2014. International law says that's not allowed. And if it's illegal, then you've got a case to go to the United Nations, the Security Council, to authorize use of force. There are things that happen from this. Big countries, traditionally, need international law for different things, for fewer things, and are less willing to be bound by it. I pointed out in the first week, one of the truly unusual aspects about the building of the international system led by the United States after World War II is the extent to which the unquestioned most powerful country on the planet was willing to subject itself to the rules that we helped to formulate and put in place. That's not something that the Habsburg Empire, that the Roman Empire, that the Spanish Empire did. Rules are for other people, not for us. And the American exceptionalism was modified here. So we've got a strange mix of things that the United States has pushed for, has achieved in the international system, that we don't actually subscribe to in a formal way. Again, I'll illustrate that in a minute. But the ideas of sovereignty, the 13 colonies wrested sovereignty from the United Kingdom. In the drafting of the US Constitution, the 13 now states delegated certain aspects of sovereignty to the federal government in Washington. But the pyramid here is the people are sovereign in the United States, have delegated some of that sovereignty to states. The states have delegated some of that to the federal government. It's all constrained in the nature of the federal system. And that kind of model shapes American attitudes towards global governance. We are unwilling to delegate very much authority to some multinational, transnational grouping. After World War II, creators of the global order decided that using international law, using multinational, multilateral organizations to prescribe and enforce behavior would result in greater stability, enhanced prosperity, and fewer dangers of conflict on it, to prevent another Great Depression, prevent another World War. That was the logic. And even though the US was the unquestioned hegemon here, the choice, do we do it entirely on our own using coercive power? Nobody had invented the idea of soft power, but rule by example because we're special. Or supplement that, complement that with international norms, international rules, international organizations that will monitor and enforce. So we've got this understandable, if you know American history, but ironic situation where we have been the leading champion of international law, of internationalizing American values, tolerance, religious tolerance, gender equality, that kind of thing, by making them international norms. We also do this instrumentally. We'd want other countries to behave in a certain way. It was ought to be and was more palatable to say, you need to act this way because that's the international standard. And we hear American politicians all the time talk about international law says this, international standard, the gold standard, this, that. Mostly they are equating American interest and desires by declaring it to be international. But many of the specific provisions of international law are an extension of what worked for the United States. They were accepted by others because we were doing okay here. But the reluctance to be bound by them, I'll go through some examples, that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, who could be against that? 196 entities have signed on to that convention. One has not. It's the United States of America. Even North Korea is signed on to this one. Why have we not signed on to it? A school of conservative thought. Children are the property of the parents. It's the same logic and same resort to biblical passages that held up legislation first limiting and then preventing child labor in the United States. That would be to interfere with the parental rights. And do we wildly abuse the rights of children? Not so much. But we don't look great for being the only country that's not signed on. As ridiculous in some respects, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That is the Americans with Disabilities Act. We passed it. Americans said this would be good for the world. Took it to the United Nations. It got passed. It's the same thing. We won't ratify it because that would infringe the sovereignty of the United States. It's a little different reason for the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It was adopted in 1975. That the US signed but never ratified. our formal position is we abide by all of the provisions of this convention, even though we haven't ratified it. Since 1975, every Secretary of Defense, not including Pete Hegseth, and every Secretary of State, not including Marco Rubio, have called upon Congress to ratify this because it weakens the American hand in trying to negotiate international questions on everything from building artificial islands and arming them in the South China Sea to maintenance of fish stocks to precluding transportation of invasive species in the ballast of ships coming into port, a whole series of things that be useful to have. We didn't ratify it and haven't ratified it because at the time, molybdenum and some other metal, a strategic metal, was available only two places, Soviet Union and South Africa, both thought to be problematic. The Hughes Corporation thought it had developed a capacity for seabed mining, pick up nodules off the bottom of the sea. And this was to protect the prospective American monopoly to get access to this strategic mineral. Now we've since discovered that this metal exists all over the world. The Hughes Corporation is out of business and the ship they built to do this broke up. But as rare earth elements have become another focus, we might want to mine the seabed here. So we haven't formally joined this treaty. A different one is the International Criminal Court, which is during the second George Bush administration. This is to actually enforce rules of law, human rights, protective kind of things, like not attacking civilians in wartime, rules of engagement. And the conservatives, mostly Republicans in the United States, went nuts. You don't subject the American military to prosecution in an international court. We took care of the excesses of the My Lai massacre, and we will police ourselves. And most people say, yeah, we probably would. Fast forward to now. President Trump has threatened to attack civilian power plants, water desalination plants, and other civilian enterprises in Iran if they don't stop blocking ships in the Straits of Hormuz. Now, he's backed off of that twice, but that is prima facie declaration of a violation of international law, which has made Vladimir Putin an indicted criminal subject to be transported to The Hague for prosecution, as were Balkan leaders in the 90s, in the Balkan wars on it. This stuff isn't all airy-fairy abstract kind of stuff. If I've suggested there's a large element of hypocrisy in American attitudes and behavior, you've heard me, right? There is. There's a larger element of incredible willingness to abide by rules, or has been until the last year. It began to erode in the first Trump administration. But most of us think of us and think of our country as being paragons of virtue. We don't need others to tell us what's right or wrong. That this is similar to an idea that goes back to the basic character of humans. Are people basically good or basically evil? that the innately good aspect of what human beings are is similar. I'll use the Chinese example because I know it better than other cultures. Confucian idea of virtue. People are capable of controlling their behavior in ways that don't do grievous harm to one another. The opposite in Chinese tradition, the opposite in Western culture is you need law and you need cops and you need judges because original sin. People can't be trusted. And there's too much at stake to leave this to well-intentioned people, leaders, nations. That there's tension all the time that plays out between values and interests. Illustrate some of them. I mentioned the Declaration of Independence. All people, it says all men, all people are endowed with certain inalienable rights by their creator. Among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pretty good. We prize this as a civilization. Fast forward a few years, the US Constitution endorses slavery. Slaves are 3/5 of a human being. Oh. Later societies, including Stanford faculty, that said this produces cognitive dissonance, right? You can't believe two diametrically opposite things at the same time. It turns out the American society does that very easily. It does it all the time. That it produces the strange bedfellows of the Cold War that I mentioned. The Shah of Iran was an egregious violator of the human rights of the Iranian people. But he was on our side of the tug of war rope with the Soviet Union. Saudi Arabia, the king of Saudi Arabia. Half the population that had the bad judgment to be born female has no rights. And we considered Saudi Arabia, man, they may not have any rights, but they got all that oil. So our interests leaned us one way, our values got subordinated to interests. Over time, at least my assessment, we've actually brought interests and values into closer alignment. And one of the points that was made in the two discussions of alliances, the alliances with Europe, NATO, and the alliances with Korea and Japan that started out purely as a security thing. Over the years, they have become alliances of value. We believe in the same thing. We want to protect the same thing. We're able to work together in the international arena under either formal or informal, conventional international law. That the US grand strategy, post-World War II grand strategy, the creation of a rules-based liberal order, and by liberal it means tolerant. You didn't have to conform exactly to the model of the United States or the model of parliamentary democracies in there. But you were able to be a part if you agreed to play by most of the rules most of the time. You agreed to play by all of them, but reality intervenes. We brought about this rules-based order in the aftermath of World War II at the time of egregious Jim Crow restrictions on at the time, 12 or 13% of the population that was African American. we had the proclamations months after we released from internment camps the Japanese Americans who'd been rounded up at the beginning, that we didn't quite walk the walk as we talk the talk. That there's been in our country a continuing kind of debate, tension between, call them conservatives, although it's not the normal terminology for it, that think that what's special about us, the unique aspects of America, that we shouldn't be bound, we need to be more free. And America first in its extreme here. And the other side is, sure, we're special, but it's better for us if we participate in and shape international behavior in ways that make life better for other people. They'll be more able to cooperate with us. They'll buy more of our good stuff. They'll send their smart kids to our universities if we do this. And as in our culture, there's not one clearly morally right or wrong or consistent wins or loses position here. Well, even though we often look hypocritical, because often we are, and we behave that way. That being the case, how does one explain American soft power? That much of the world admired us, wanted to be like us, was willing to adjust their own behavior to conform more closely to what we thought was appropriate. A big part of it was our example. By doing the things that we did, even when they were pretty bad, 50s, in the 50s, 1960s, a little earlier than that, we appeared to be moving in a positive direction on the things that we proclaim. And the hard-run Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s that were long overdue and still imperfectly enforced, but it helped to close the hypocrisy gap at a time when the rest of the world, we're transparent to the rest of the world. They can watch us on television. It's not just the Hollywood vision of what America thought of itself as. And we've flipped from looking like we're trying to be better. I'm actually doing better to Minneapolis on the news around the world every night. So it's understandable that we think we're better than we actually are, but why did other countries go along with us when at least the elite knew we were imperfect? One was our hegemonic status. Put another way, it was our football. So we got to make the rules. You want to play in the US dominated system, you play by our rules. Happily for the world, most of the rules that we want to put in place were currently pretty good rules here. We provide protection for much of the world that mattered. The former imperial states, the allies, and the adversaries in World War II, extended deterrence. We provided security so that they could rebuild and modernize, and then the newly independent countries. Our economic policies, our trade policies, their security policies improve their life. So, hey, the Americans are doing good stuff. Go along on this. We built many of the values that we espouse into United Nations and other international conventions. It took the sting out of the American dictating it. It's now become an international norm or an international rule to be followed. Some places, some of the time, recognized for what it was, that this was a contrivance by the United States. But pretty quickly, playing by the rules brought visible and tangible benefits to lots of people and lots of countries. So it started out in some sense as an American imposition on the global order, has become a valued part of the international system, valued by others. Going back to one of the questions posed in the article that we read, can this international order, the rules-based part of it, survive without the United States in the driver's seat? I think the answer is clearly yes, it can. And countries are already doing things to work around us. And a clear example was mentioned by Dan Snyder, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was to be a basically trade group, 12 countries, that initially proposed by Brunei and Singapore and Peru, I think. The United States not interested. Those three countries accounted for less than 5% of US trade. Why would we care? Then Prime Minister Abe of Japan wanted to make a number of changes in Japanese domestic policy. Abenomics, he called it, that involved opening Japan more. Doing that purely as an internal thing, that was going to be hard. He said, I want to lock this in with an international treaty. He said, Japan will join the negotiations, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Washington says, hello, we've been trying for 50 years to get the Japanese to negotiate on this stuff. Abe said we could do it in that arena. We were in those negotiations. Suddenly, this is 40% of US trade. And it was just about all wrapped up, and Trump pulled out. Did it fall apart? No, it didn't. The Japanese kept it going as the TPP 11. The 11 countries, many of whom had been persuaded to make concessions, particularly like Vietnam, that the Americans demanded. Well, they made the concessions, they're in there. It opened up agricultural markets. Americans aren't filling them in here. Is that example is being played out again and again and again, that we're not so critical or indispensable as we pretended we were. Now, let me close with some implications of what's going on. That President Trump has demonstrated very little concern for human rights at home or abroad. A complete disdain for international organizations. United Nations, World Health Organization, International Criminal Court. That his disinterest is much more severe than any predecessors who adopted case by case. Ronald Reagan decided not to participate in or obey the International Court of Justice when it ruled that what the United States was doing in mining harbors in Nicaragua violated international law. I'm not pulling out of the International Court of Justice. I'm just not going to obey that. Which set a precedent for others. That the domestic policies on everything from the terrible disparagement of Americans with disabilities, or making fun of female journalists or the way we are treating immigrants in our country, the way we are treating local governments. All of this is fully transparent, and it is just dissipated the soft power. Go along with the Americans because they're a role model that we want. We're not a role model they want to follow. That the world, my judgment, my experience, sees U.S. behavior now not as one man's perversion of the system, but as a reflection of citizen views. We elected him twice. We elected members of Congress who are docile, spineless in this regard. This has been interpreted by friends as well as folks who are not particularly enamored of American uniqueness as reflecting our true colors. We tried to fool the world into thinking we were somehow different than the worst of the other big powers. And now we've demonstrated we're not any better than anybody else here. So why would we listen to the Americans? The advocates of American exceptionalism and indispensable behavior, indispensability, argue that rules-based order and international law are highly fragile and cannot survive without U.S. leadership. History will prove whether this is or isn't right. I believe it is wrong. I think the world has transformed enough in the last 80 years that it no longer needs the United States to perform the kind of role that we did. What we did was amazing. The success of those policies is extraordinary. But it had the effect of making others less dependent on the United States. I happen to think that's a good thing. But there are plenty of serious American political actors, put Dick Cheney in that category, who think the opposite, that without us, it all falls apart. And we can't let it fall apart because we would have negative consequences right away. The Trump administration returned to the idea that might makes right is really upsetting to much of the world because not many other countries can even begin to approach the power, all kinds of power that the United States has. The actions of the last year have diminished our soft power, the ability to lead by example and by respect. We should not want the world to emulate our recent behavior. And the war in Iran is only the most extreme and recent example. It's going to be much more difficult for the United States to mobilize collective action in support of U.S. objectives. And you can take the Trump admonition to allies to send ships to clear the Strait of Hormuz. And every one of them said, no way. You made this bed, you sleep in it. Other nations are all ready and will continue to try to insulate themselves from the ability of the United States to shape or to interfere in their activities. As an abstract idea, that's probably a good thing. But most of the time, we're not such a bad place. Behavior of American firms internationally is pretty commendable by and large. We don't send large numbers of expats over to run things. We bring locals into the operation early on. And education, training, healthcare, all of these things that we've done, for some period of time, we're going to have less ability to lead, and there'll be more mistakes made as others fumble and stumble because nobody is yet willing to take on the risks, the costs, the responsibilities of maintaining a very complicated global order. So it's got enough inertia in it to keep going for a while. I believe certainly through the next 3 years, but not indefinitely. And let me stop there. I only went 5 minutes longer than I planned to, and open it up to questions. And I'm happy to start in the room, if there are any. No questions? A perfect lecture that answered everything. Lou, do you have anybody on board?
Yes, we had one comment. Let me try to paraphrase it if I can. Mike was saying that, as you pointed out, treaties are binding only after ratified by the Senate. But over the years, the Senate has attached reservations and exceptions on what parts would be binding and what parts would be not. And the approved parts would be subject to our Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So the paraphrase is, yeah, we've signed a lot, we haven't ratified a lot, but the ones we have worked on ratifying, we've put some handcuffs in. Would you like to comment on that, rather oversimplification?
If I understand what's being asked correctly, and I'm not sure that I do, that which parts of agreements would we find it easier to go along with, that we do go along with, and which parts are objectionable? That there is an answer to that with all of the agreements. I don't happen to know them, but what I do know is this, that they are not like a Chinese menu. You opt in or you stay out. If you opt in, you are accepting all of the conditions, even the ones that you may not like very much, because as a country, you make a judgment that it nets out to my benefit to do this. So I will run a little bit risk. I'll accept a little more constraint. And where people are on the political spectrum in the United States affects how much risk they're willing to accept, how large a constraint on American behavior. As I frame the people with disabilities and the protection of children things, to me, this is as close to a complete no-brainer as anything I can think of. But clearly there are enough people in enough politically relevant constituencies to have blocked it. And once it gets to it's blocked, then like everything else, it becomes trading material. I'm opposed to it now, but I might be persuaded to go along with it if you support the legislation that I want. The SAVE Act on voter ID as a specific example. So very quickly, things become offensive to potential partners. So it's easier to just leave it alone. We're not egregiously violating these things. Most of the time, we behave in an acceptable way. And it's just the professional diplomats that have to deal with you have no standing to complain about my non-compliance with a treaty that you don't belong to. And that's a fair point. Doesn't stop Americans because we're special. Even though we don't subscribe to we have no qualms about telling people how they ought to behave. People in the room? Yeah, Norman?
How do you square China's willingness to sign on to the responsibility to protect with their allergy when the United States criticizes them for the treatment of Uyghurs and they say, you're interfering in our internal affairs?
Yeah. To make sure everybody heard the question, how do we square China's support for responsibility to protect with their allergy to anything that smacks of interference in their internal affairs, violation of their sovereignty? The Chinese have a pretty, it's normally in the political science, a strict interpretation of sovereignty. Inside my borders, I can do whatever I want, and you have no standing to do it. That the R2P precondition that gives the international system, not the meddlesome Americans. I once wrote a piece called Meddlesome Mother-in-Law to describe American behavior around the world. That it's not Americans, it's the international system, where there are a lot of other countries that have a view of sovereignty closer to China's than the way in which we have interpreted it for the last 80 years. That the idea that there is a higher authority than the government of the country, that doesn't go down that well in China. The other aspect of it is we don't think we are abusing our Uyghur population. That we're giving them the tools to compete effectively in a modern society and economy. They can't succeed in all of China if they can't speak Mandarin. That the zero-sum time allotment to working on whatever the minority language is not devoted to computer science or math. And there's a certain truth to that in it, but and it's understandable to many other countries in this, and they have not been shy about pointing out the inconsistencies of American rhetoric and behavior. That in a lot of the arguments that have been used go back before Civil Rights Act, 1905. What about the way you treat Native peoples on your reservations, and what you did to them? That this was their country, and the white guys drove them into the least hospitable parts of the country. They brought it back during the first Trump administration, when anti-China stuff spilled over into anti-Asian, because most Americans can't tell the difference, a Japanese, a Korean, a Chinese, a Tongan, a Pacific Islander. So the outrageous treatment of our own citizens and the inadequacy of the response of the US government really undercuts our standing to be critical of others. And the Chinese and others are very quick to point that out and very effective at mobilizing other countries to join in the criticism of us. If we actually were perfect, it wouldn't sting so much. Yes, I've got another one here, Lou.
Go ahead.
understand that Grotius, who you mentioned, some of his work considered rights for people as opposed to rights in nature.
Right.
And that in considering the rights for people, it was perfectly legitimate for people to sell their rights, i.e. to sell their being into slavery. Now, you mentioned, in terms of international, the child, I'm not quite sure the term was, but call it the Child Act. The United States would not verify it because of certain interests. And the interest said, we will vote for that if you vote for what we want too. And that's all just exchange.
Mhm.
How do we get, I mean, to me, it seems a simple line from Grotius to that congressperson. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't pretend to have any expertise on Grotius. I know some because I studied politics for a long time. But one point I want to pick up was the rights of the individual to dispose of their freedom, right? I have to become a slave, not a slave, an indentured servant. I mean, to the extent that difference, that people who accepted 7 years of servitude in exchange for passage to come to the United States, or an apprenticeship to work without compensation for some period of time in order that, my understanding is that is a right that is inherent in an individual that is different than I don't have a right to enslave you against your will. I don't have a right to take the resources out of your territory without your permission and agreeing to a price or whatever it is. And what it's reacting against is the Hobbesian view of nature, that the natural world is, life in the natural world is nasty, brutish, and short because there are no rules. And the Enlightenment out of which the United States developed the political theory and the Declaration and the Constitution comes out of the idea that man is good, but not perfect. And in order to protect rights, to create opportunities or protect opportunities, you have to have some rules, structure in there. They need to be fair, they need to be just, and here the values don't quite comport with the legislation for a long time. But it was going against ideas that sovereignty was unlimited. If you're the king, you can do whatever you want in there. That in commercial activities, that honesty was not necessary. It's, screw your partner before they screw you out of the deal, because this is also getting into the age of capitalism, which is attempting to, again, impose some rules on behavior that was not so structured for a long time. I don't know if that's getting at your question, but thank you for it. Let me see if Lou's got one first, Norm.
No, we're all quiet here, so you can just keep going, Tom.
Does Iran have a legitimate claim to extend its sovereignty over the Hormuz Strait?
Does Iran have the authority to extend its sovereignty over the Straits of Hormuz? Before you get to authority, does it have the capacity to impose its will on management of it? It clearly does. That under the law of the sea, international law, straits used for international travel are not they're supposed to remain open. In the way that Trump, because he doesn't know anything about international law, I mean, he has not argued that these straits need to remain open because of international law. Somebody probably told him, if you say something like that, the rest of the world will say, you're not a member. So you have no standing to complain. But territorially, the border, the maritime border would be at the midpoint. So up to that midline would fall within territorial waters of Iran and certain rules of, but because it is a recognized and identified strait, like the Straits of Malacca, that a different set of provisions kick in. So it's, but again, I had 1 year of international law a long time ago, so I don't claim great expertise here, but Iran would not have the right under international law to close the strait. It has the right under international law to do a lot of stuff between the shore and the start of the designated as the strait. The strait is, I think, 21 miles wide. So that's either big or small, depending what your frame of reference is. Pretty small for the size of the ships going through it. And does that get at your question? Peter's got one.
I was taken by the comment about selling the person's right to sell themselves into servitude and such. And I'm wondering, as far as our relationship with Mexico over the last 50 years, has there been any positive attempt to have that soft power influence as far as, you were saying we have our example or something like, people would want to emulate our lifestyles, but isn't it kind of a natural thing that we have this big problem with people that have sacrificed everything that they could have hoped for in terms of the American dream and just came here? And I just don't understand how that problem has been affected by law, because it's just odd.
It's a good question, Peter, and one to answer properly. It's got lots and lots of dimensions. Let me pick out a couple that for Mexicans, as they put it, that their greatest problem is God is so far away and the Yankees are next door, right? That they have to deal with us. An amazing thing about the relationship is big chunks of what is now the United States were part of Mexico until the 1840s. And part of it even later than that, into the very early in the 20th century. Many, many countries have territorial disputes, have border tensions because ownership of territory or control of territory has changed over time. And one of the recurring challenges of international relations, international law is, when do you start the clock? When do you say, it was mine on that date? We'll not worry about how it got to be mine on that date. China's mainland and Taiwan. The mainland hasn't controlled Taiwan since 1895. And in between, it was controlled by Japan, and then it reverted to the government that lost in the Chinese Civil War in there. So where do you start the clock? And international law, mine is not particularly helpful in it because it's got different provisions that kick in on different times. That the relationship between the United States and Mexico has mostly been pretty good for both sides. It's been better for us than it's been for them. We've become richer, so we are a magnet for economic migrants seeking a better life, as well as different times seeking a less harsh or less repressive regime or less crime affecting them. But one of the things, even while I was still in government, being in Mexico City, so somewhere around 20 years ago, that meeting with the Minister of Interior, and he posed it as, what are you going to do when there are no more Mexicans coming north? And this is before we had A Day Without Mexicans in California movie. But the trend that he correctly pointed to was the substantial decline in people coming north as more jobs were created in Mexico and as wages went up in Mexico. And I think I've said in this group at different times, everybody that's in the United States is by definition an oddball. Because we either are or are descended from the less than 1% of the population everywhere that will leave home, that will leave family, religion, language, graves, customs in search of something else. So when we talk to the rest of the world, there's a lot of talking past that we don't get it and they don't get us. That we value a lot of things more than we value the family farm that's been there for 300 years, attending the church that the family has gone to forever, and on and on and on. The Mexican situation, as I think accurately was describing it to me, that government policies, a lot of these were policies since the mid-'80s, when Salinas did something like what I referred to Abe doing in Japan. He really changed domestic economic legislation that was adopted early in the 20th century in the Mexican Revolution to limit foreign involvement, to create state monopolies. And the reason the United States jumped on the trade agreement with Canada and Mexico in the first Bush administration was to lock in these reforms, lock them in with an international treaty, which is what Abe wanted to do with the reforms in Japan. So make it much harder for Mexico to go back to restrictions on investment, restrictions on training, restrictions on wages and unions and so forth, that worked. And as the movement south, last year that I paid any attention to, it was, I guess, during Obama, there were more people moving from north to south than from Mexico. There were others coming through Mexico. And that's where the international law gets real tricky here, as Mexico has international obligations to deal with the migrants and refugees on its territory before they get to the United States. For much of recent history, Mexico didn't have the capacity to deal with large numbers of migrants going through in search of work, depressing wage, all of the stuff that the MAGA folks either point to accurately or make up and exaggerate about our southern border applied to Mexico. But the interdependence of the economies, now, if you haven't been to one of the border economies down there, you have to experience it. There is no border, right? There's a make-believe line there, but people go back and forth, families on both sides. Their local economy is so interconnected, and I'm going to run over to give an anecdote and then bring this to a close. In the early 90s, I went down to go out with the Border Patrol in El Paso. Out in El Paso at 5:30 in the morning, I went down to the Rio Grande to watch people coming across on pieces of plywood on top of big inner tubes from trucks and stuff. And the head of the Border Patrol is with him, and folks coming in, they're all greeting him. Hi, George, how you doing today? And he knew him. Hey, Felipe. Hi, Jesus. How you doing? What the hell's going on here? He says, these are not immigrating in. So we got 3 fences. The first one we cut, so we know where people are going through, so it's orderly. The second one we cut for the same reason. We don't worry about anybody until they get to 25 miles from the border. They're seriously wanting to enter the country illegally. He says, some of these people coming across this way have cards. They could enter legally. They choose not to do it because there's a backup on the bridge. They can get here faster. He says, if we come back here at 5:30 tonight, you'll see the reverse flow. He says, it's not all the same people. Somebody drove in legally through the bridge. They went shopping at Safeway. They're going back this way so they don't have to pay tax on the Mexican side. And does this go on? He says, we all understand it. It's all part of the local economy. It's got very little to do with Washington rules and desires. And those kind of situations exist to one extent or another in lots of places around the globe, that the mutually beneficial locals work it out. Looking at Rick, I mean, I had it explained by Texas officials that they didn't have Mexicans in Texas. They're not Mexicans. They're Texicans. They're Texicans. They belong here. They contribute here. They don't happen to have citizenship here, but they're Texicans. They're an integral part of us. I've run out the clock, and I didn't intend that. Lou, did you have any last questions on board?
No questions from here, Tom.
Okay. Well, let me thank everybody for being here. Thank Lou for monitoring the Zoom. I have 3 chapters out of the workbook that I reproduced and had them so I could scan them to people. They're here. If anybody wants to take one or all of them, are welcome to it. We are off next week for Easter, but we do have one more session on international organizations. Now, another one of the pieces in the grand strategy that was discussed in the very first lecture, that the person who will do it, Steve Stedman, is a good friend of many years. He, among other things, a professor at Stanford, but among other things, he was the Assistant General Secretary of the United Nations under Kofi Annan. And then he worked for Kofi and the foundation. And the idea is building, revitalizing more of the international institutions to do things. So he'll be great, I'm sure, 2 weeks from today. Thank you all, and you can turn us off.
All
Thank
right,
you.
again, thank you very much. I'm going to stop the recording and then I will stop the meeting. Good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
Tom.
Thank you.